After reading only the first 3 chapters of The Kite Runner, I'm already anxious to see what will happen to the unlikely friendship between Amir and Hassan. So let's pick up where we left off. Chapter 4. In 1933, the year Baba was born, and the year Zahir Shah began his 40-year reign of Afghanistan, 2 brothers, young men from a wealthy and reputable family in Kabul, got behind the wheel of their father's Ford Roadster. High on hashish and massed on French wine, they struck and killed a Hazara husband and wife on the road to Pakman. The police brought the somewhat contrite young men and the dead couple's 5-year-old orphan boy before my grandfather, who was a highly regarded judge and a man of impeccable reputation. After hearing the brothers' account and their father's plea for mercy, my grandfather ordered the 2 young men to go to Kandahar at once and enlist in the army for 1 year. This despite the fact that their family had somehow managed to obtain them exemptions from the draft. Their father argued, but not too vehemently, and in the end everyone agreed that the punishment had been perhaps harsh but fair. As for an orphan, my grandfather adopted him into his own household and told the other servants to tutor him but to be kind to him. That boy was Ali. Ali and Baba grew up together as childhood playmates, at least until polio crippled Ali's leg, just like Hassan and I grew up a generation later. Baba was always telling us about the mischief he and Ali used to cause, and Ali would shake his head and say, "But Agha Sahib, tell them who was the architect of the mischief and who the poor laborer." Baba would laugh and throw his arm around Ali, but in none of his stories did Baba ever refer to Ali as his friend. The curious thing was, I never thought of Hassan and me as friends either. Not in the usual sense anyhow. Never mind that we taught each other to ride a bicycle with no hands or to build a fully functional homemade camera out of cardboard box. Never mind that we spent entire winter flying kites, running kites. Never mind that to me, the face of Afghanistan is that of a boy with a thin-boned frame, a shaved head, and low-set ears. A boy with a Chinese doll face, perpetually lit by a hair-lipped smile. Never mind any of those things, because history isn't easy to overcome. Neither is religion. In the end, I was a Pashtun and he was a Hazara. I was Sunni and he was Shia. And nothing was ever going to change that. Nothing. But we were kids who had learned to crawl together. And no history, ethnicity, society, or religion was going to change that either. I spent most of the first 12 years of my life playing with Hassan. Sometimes my entire childhood seems like one long lazy summer day with Hassan, chasing each other between tangles of trees in my father's yard. Playing hide and seek, cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, insect torture with our crowning achievement, undeniably the time we plucked the stinger of a bee and tied the sting around the poor thing to yank it back every time it took fly. We chased the Kuchi, the nomads who passed through Kabul on their way to the mountains of the north. We would hear their caravans approaching our neighborhood, the mewling of their sheep, the baying of their goats, the jingle bells around their camels' necks. We'd run outside to watch the caravan plod through our street, men with dusty, weather-beaten faces and women dressed in long, colorful shawls, beads and silver bracelets around their wrists and ankles. We hurled pebbles at their goats. We squirted water on their mules. I'd make Hassan sit on the wall of ailing corn and fire pebbles with his slingshot at the camels' rears. We saw our first Western together, Rio Bravo with John Wayne, at the cinema park across the street from my favorite bookstore. I remember begging Baba to take us to Iran so we could meet John Wayne. Baba burst out in gales of his deep-throated laughter, a sound not unlike a truck engine revving up, and when he could talk again, explained to us the concept of voice dubbing. Hassan and I were stunned, dazed. John Wayne didn't really speak Farsi, and he wasn't Iranian. He was American, just like the friendly long-haired men and women we always saw hanging around in Kabul, dressed in their tattered, brightly colored shirts. We saw Rio Bravo 3 times, but we saw our favorite Western, The Magnificent Seven, 13 times. With each viewing, we cried at the end when the Mexican kids buried Charles Bronson, who, as it turned out, wasn't Iranian either. We took strolls in the musty-smelling bazaars of the Shahr-e-No section of Kabul, or the New City, west of the Wazir Akbar Khan district. We talked about whatever film we had just seen and walked amid the bustling crowds of bazaris. We snaked our way among the merchants and the beggars, wandered through narrow alleys crammed with rows of tiny, tightly packed stalls. Baba gave us each a weekly allowance of 10 Afghanis, and we spent it on warm Coca-Cola and rosewater ice cream topped with crushed pistachios. During the school year, we had a daily routine. By the time I dragged myself out of bed and lumbered to the bathroom, Hassan had already washed up, prayed the morning namaz with Ali, and prepared my breakfast. Hot black tea with 3 sugar cubes and a slice of toasted naan topped with my favorite sour cherry marmalade, all neatly placed on a dining table. While I ate and complained about homework, Hassan made my bed, polished my shoes, ironed my outfit for the day, packed my books and pencils. I'd hear him singing to himself in the foyer as he ironed, singing old Hazara songs in his nasal voice. Then Baba and I drove off in his black Ford Mustang, a car that drew envious looks everywhere because it was the same car Steve McQueen had driven in Bullitt, a film that played in one theater for 6 months. Hassan stayed home and helped Ali with the day's chores, hand-washing dirty clothes and hanging them to dry in the yard, sweeping the floors, buying fresh naan from the bazaar, marinating meat for dinner, watering the lawn. After school, Hassan and I met up, grabbed a book, and trotted up a bowl-shaped hill just north of my father's property in Wazir Akbar Khan. There was an old abandoned cemetery atop the hill, with rows of unmarked headstones and tangles of brushwood clogging the aisles. Seasons of rain and snow had turned the iron gate rusty and left the cemetery's low white stone walls in decay. There was a pomegranate tree near the entrance to the cemetery. One summer day, I used one of Ali's kitchen knives to carve our names on it. Amir and Hassan, the sultans of Kabul. Those words made it formal. The tree was ours. After school, Hassan and I climbed its branches and snatched its blood-red pomegranates. After we'd eaten the fruit and wiped our hands on the grass, I would read to Hassan. Sitting cross-legged, sunlight and shadows of pomegranate leaves dancing on his face, Hassan absently plucked blades of grass from the ground as I read him stories he couldn't read himself. That Hassan would grow up illiterate like Ali and most Hazaras had been decided the minute he had been born, perhaps even the moment he had been conceived in Sanubar's unwelcoming womb. After all, what use did a servant have for the written word? But despite his illiteracy, or maybe because of it, Hassan was drawn to the mystery of words, seduced by a secret world forbidden to him. I read him poems and stories, sometimes riddles, though I stopped reading those when I saw he was far better at solving them than I was. So I read him unchallenging things, like the misadventures of the bumbling Mullah Nasreddin and his donkey. We sat for hours under the tree, sat there until the sun faded in the west, and still Hassan insisted we had enough daylight for one more story, one more chapter. My favorite part of reading to Hassan was when he came across a big word that he didn't know. I'd tease him, expose his ignorance. One time, I was reading him a Mullah Nasreddin story, and he stopped me. "What does that word mean?" "Which one?" "Imbecile." "You don't know what it means?" I said, grinning. "Nay, Amir Agha, but it's such a common word." "Still, I don't know it. If he felt the sting of my tease, his smiling face didn't show it. Well, everyone in my school knows what it means, I said. Let's see. Imbecile, it means smart, intelligent. I'll use it in a sentence for you. When it comes to words, Hassan is an imbecile. Ah, he said, nodding. I would always feel guilty about it later. So I tried to make up for it by giving him one of my old shirts or a broken toy. I would tell myself that was immense enough for a harmless prank. Hassan's favorite book by far was the Shahnameh, the 10th century epic of ancient Persian heroes. He liked all of the chapters, the Shahs of Old, Feridun, Zal, Rudabe. But his favorite story and mine was Rostam and Sohrab, the tale of the great warrior Rostam and his fleet-footed horse Rakhsh. Rostam mortally wounds his valiant nemesis Sohrab in battle, only to discover that Sohrab is his long-lost son. Stricken with grief, Rostam hears his son's dying words. If thou art indeed my father, then hast thou stained thy sword in the lifeblood of thy son, and do this of thine obstinacy. For I thought to behold in thee the tokens recounted of my mother. But I appealed unto thy heart in vain, and now is the time gone for meeting. Read it again, please, Amir Agha, Hassan would say. Sometimes tears pooled in Hassan's eyes as I read him this passage, and I always wondered whom he wept for. The grief-stricken Rostam who tears his clothes and covers his head with ashes, or the dying Sohrab who only longed for his father's love. Personally, I couldn't see the tragedy in Rostam's fate. After all, didn't all fathers in their secret hearts harbor a desire to kill their sons? One day in July 1973, I played another little trick on Hassan. I was reading to him, and suddenly I strayed from the written story. I pretended I was reading from the book, flipping pages regularly, but I had abandoned the text altogether, taken over the story, and made up my own. Hassan, of course, was oblivious to this. To him, the words on the page were a scramble of codes, indecipherable, mysterious. Words were secret doorways, and I held all the keys. After, I started to ask him if he'd liked the story, a giggle rising in my throat, when Hassan began to clap. "What are you doing?" I said. "That was the best story you've read to me in a long time," he said, still clapping. I laughed. "Really?" "Really." "That's fascinating," I muttered. "I meant it too. This was wholly unexpected." "Are you sure, Hassan?" He was still clapping. "It was great, Amir Agha. Will you read me more of it tomorrow?" "Fascinating," I repeated, a little breathless feeling like a man who discovers a buried treasure in his own backyard. Walking down the hill, thoughts were exploding in my head, like the fireworks at Chaman. "Best story you've read me in a long time," he'd said. I had read him a lot of stories. Hassan was asking me something. "What?" I said. "What does that mean, fascinating?" I laughed, clutched him in a hug, and planted a kiss on his cheek. "What was that for?" he said, startled, blushing. I gave him a friendly shove, smiled. "You're a prince, Hassan. You're a prince, and I love you." That same night, I wrote my first short story. It took me 30 minutes. It was a dark little tale about a man who found a magic cup and learned that if he wept into the cup, his tears turned into pearls. But even though he had always been poor, he was a happy man and rarely shed a tear. So he found ways to make himself sad so that his tears could make him rich. As the pearls piled up, so did his greed grow. The story ended with the man sitting on a mountain of pearls, knife in hand, weeping helplessly into the cup with his beloved wife's slain body in his arms. That evening, I climbed the stairs and walked into Baba's smoking room. In my hands, the 2 sheets of paper on which I had scribbled the story. Baba and Rahim Khan were smoking pipes and sipping brandy when I came in. "What is it, Amir?" Baba said, reclining on the sofa and lacing his hands behind his head. Blue smoke swirled around his face. His glare made my throat feel dry. I cleared it and told him I'd written a story. Baba nodded and gave a thin smile that conveyed little more than feigned interest. "Well, that's very good, isn't it?" he said. Then nothing more. He just looked at me through the cloud of smoke. I probably stood there for under a minute, but to this day, it was one of the longest minutes of my life. Seconds plodded by, each separated from the next by an eternity. Air grew heavy, damp, almost solid. I was breathing bricks. Baba went on staring me down and didn't offer to read. As always, it was Rahim Khan who rescued me. He held out his hand and favored me with a smile that had nothing feigned about it. "May I have it, Amir John? I would very much like to read it." Baba hardly ever used the term of endearment, John, when he addressed me. Baba shrugged and stood up. He looked relieved, as if he too had been rescued by Rahim Khan. "Yes, give it to Kaka Rahim. I'm going upstairs to get ready." And with that, he left the room. Most days, I worshipped Baba with an intensity approaching the religious. But right then, I wished I could open my veins and drain his cursed blood from my body. An hour later, as the evening sky dimmed, the 2 of them drove off in my father's car to attend the party. On his way out, Rahim Khan hunkered before me and handed me my story and another folded piece of paper. He flashed a smile and winked. "For you, read it later." Then he paused and added a single word that did more to encourage me to pursue writing than any compliment any editor has ever paid me. That word was bravo. When they left, I sat on my bed and wished Rahim Khan had been my father. Then I thought of Baba and his great big chest and how good it felt when he held me against it, how he smelled of broth in the morning, and how his beard tickled my face. I was overcome with such sudden guilt that I bolted to the bathroom and vomited in the sink. Later that night, curled up in bed, I read Rahim Khan's note over and over. It read like this: "Amir John, I enjoyed your story very much, mashallah. God has granted you a special talent. It is now your duty to hone that talent, because a person who wastes his God-given talents is a donkey. You have written your story with sound grammar and interesting style, but the most impressive thing about your story is that it has irony. You may not even know what that word means, but you will someday. It is something that some writers reach for their entire careers and never attain. You have achieved it with your first story. My door is and always will be open to you, Amir John. I shall hear any story you have to tell. Bravo. Your friend, Rahim." Buoyed by Rahim Khan's note, I grabbed the story and hurried downstairs to the foyer where Ali and Hassan were sleeping on a mattress. That was the only time they slept in the house, when Baba was away and Ali had to watch over me. I shook Hassan awake and asked him if he wanted to hear a story. He rubbed his sleep-clogged eyes and stretched. "Now? What time is it?" "Never mind the time. The story is special. I wrote it myself," I whispered, hoping not to wake Ali. Hassan's face brightened. "Then I have to hear it," he said, already pulling the blanket off him. "Then I have to hear it," he said, already pulling the blanket off him. I read it to him in the living room by the marble fireplace. No playful straying from the words this time. This was about me. Hassan was the perfect audience in many ways, totally immersed in the tale, his face shifting with the changing tones in the story, When I read the last sentence, he made a muted clapping sound with his hands. MashaAllah, Amir Agha, bravo! He was beaming. You liked it? I said, getting my second taste, and how sweet it was of a positive review. Someday, inshallah, you will be a great writer, Hassan said, and people all over the world will read your stories. You exaggerate, Hassan, I said, loving him for it. No, you will be great and famous, he insisted. Then he paused, as if on the verge of adding something. He weighed his words and cleared his throat. But will you permit me to ask a question about the story? He said shyly. Of course. Well, he started, broke off. Tell me, Hassan, I said. I smiled, though suddenly the insecure writer in me wasn't so sure he wanted to hear it. Well, he said, if I may ask, why did the man kill his wife? In fact, why did he ever have to feel sad to shed tears? Couldn't he have just smelled an onion? I was stunned. That particular point, so obvious it was utterly stupid, hadn't even occurred to me. I moved my lips soundlessly. It appeared that on the same night I had learned about one of writing's objectives, irony, I would also be introduced to one of its pitfalls, the plot hole. Taught by Hassan, of all people, Hassan who couldn't read and had never written a single word in his entire life. A voice, cold and dark, suddenly whispered in my ear. What does he know? That illiterate Hazara. He'll never be anything but a cook. How dare he criticize you? Well, I began, but I never got to finish that sentence because suddenly Afghanistan changed forever. Chapter 5. Something roared like thunder. The earth shook a little and we heard the rat-tat-tat of gunfire. Father, Hassan cried. We sprung to our feet and raced out the living room. We found Ali hobbling frantically across the foyer. Father, what's that sound? Hassan yelped, his hands outstretched toward Ali. Ali wrapped his arms around us. A white light flashed, lit the sky in silver. It flashed again and was followed by a rapid staccato of gunfire. They're hunting ducks, Ali said in hoarse voice. They hunt ducks at night, you know. Don't be afraid. A siren went off in the distance. Somewhere glass shattered and someone shouted. I heard people on the street, jolted from sleep and probably still in their pajamas, with ruffled hair and puffy eyes. Hassan was crying. Ali pulled him close, clutched him with tenderness. Later, I would tell myself I hadn't felt envious of Hassan, not at all. We stayed huddled that way until the early hours of the morning. The shootings and explosions had lasted less than an hour, but they had frightened us badly because none of us had ever heard gunshots in the streets. They were foreign sounds to us then, the generation of Afghan children whose ears would know nothing but the sounds of bombs and gunfire was not yet born. Huddled together in the dining room and waiting for the sun to rise, none of us had any notion that a way of life had ended, our way of life. If not quite yet, then at least it was the beginning of the end. The end, the official end, would come first in April 1978 with the communist coup d'etat, and then in December 1979, when Russian tanks would roll onto the very same streets where Hassan and I played, bringing the death of the Afghanistan I knew and marking the start of a still ongoing era of bloodletting. But before sunrise, Baba's car peeled into the driveway. His door slammed shut and his running footsteps pounded the stairs. Then he appeared in the doorway and I saw something on his face, something I didn't recognize right away because I'd never seen it before. Fear. Amir, Hassan, he exclaimed as he ran to us, opening his arms wide. They blocked all the roads and telephone didn't work. I was so worried. We let him wrap us in his arms, and for a brief, insane moment, I was glad about whatever had happened that night. They weren't shooting ducks after all. As it turned out, they hadn't shot much of anything that night of July 17th, 1973. Kabul awoke the next morning to find that the monarchy was a thing of the past. The king, Zahir Shah, was away in Italy. In his absence, his cousin Daud Khan had ended his king's 40-year reign with a bloodless coup. I remember Hassan and I crouching that next morning outside my father's study, as Baba and Rahim Khan sipped black tea and listened to breaking news of the coup in Radio Kabul. Amir Agha, Hassan whispered. What? What's a republic? I shrugged. I don't know. On Baba's radio, they were saying that word republic over and over again. Amir Agha, what? Does republic mean father and I will have to move away? I don't think so, I whispered back. Hassan considered this. Amir Agha, what? I don't want them to send me and father away. I smiled. Bas, you donkey, no one's sending you away. Amir Agha, what? Do you want to go climb our tree? My smile broadened. There was another thing about Hassan. He always knew when to say the right thing. The news on the radio was getting pretty boring. Hassan went to his shack to get ready, and I ran upstairs to grab a book. Then I went to the kitchen, stuffed my pockets with handfuls of pine nuts, and ran outside to find Hassan waiting for me. We burst through the front gates and headed for the hill. We crossed the residential streets and were trekking through a barren patch of rough land that led to the hill when, suddenly, a rock struck Hassan in the back. We whirled around and my heart dropped. Asef and two of his friends, Vali and Kamal, were approaching us. Asef was the son of one of my father's friends, Mahmoud, an airline pilot. His family lived a few streets south of our home, in a posh, high-walled compound with palm trees. If you were a kid living in the Wazir Akbar Khan section of Kabul, you knew about Asef and his famous stainless steel brass knuckles, hopefully not through personal experience. Born to a German mother and Afghan father, the blonde, blue-eyed Asef towered over other kids. His well-earned reputation for savagery preceded him on the streets. Flanked by his obeying friends, he walked the neighborhood like a Khan strolling through his land with his eager-to-please entourage. His word was law, and if you needed a little legal education, then those brass knuckles were just the right teaching tool. I saw him use those knuckles once on a kid from the Karte Char district. I will never forget how Asef's blue eyes glinted with a light not entirely sane, and how he grinned as he pummeled that poor kid unconscious. Some of the boys in Wazir Akbar Khan had nicknamed him Asef Gushkhor, or Asef the Ear Eater. Of course, none of them dared utter it to his face unless they wished to suffer the same fate as the poor kid who had unwittingly inspired that nickname when he had fought Asef over a kite and ended up fishing his right ear from a muddy gutter. Years later, I learned an English word for the creature that Asef was, a word for which a good Farsi equivalent does not exist: sociopath. Of all the neighborhood boys who tortured Ali, Asef was by far the most relentless. He was in fact the originator of the Babalu jeer. Hey Babalu, who did you eat today, huh? Come on Babalu, give us a smile. And on days when he felt particularly inspired, he spiced up his badgering a little. Hey you flat-nosed Babalu, who did you eat today? Tell us, you slant-eyed donkey. Now he was walking toward us, hands on his hips, his sneakers kicking up little puffs of dust. Good morning, Kunis. This doesn't sound right. Asif exclaimed, waving. That was another of his favorite insults. Hassan retreated behind me as the three older boys closed in. They stood before us, three tall boys dressed in jeans and t-shirts, towering over us all. Asif crossed his thick arms on his chest, a savage sort of grin on his lips. Not for the first time, it occurred to me that Asif might not be entirely sane. It also occurred to me how lucky I was to have Baba as my father, the sole reason I believe Asif had mostly refrained from harassing me too much. He tripped his chin to Hassan. "Hey, Flatnose," he said, "how is Babalu?" Hassan said nothing and crept another step behind me. "Have you heard the news, boys?" Asif said, his grin never flattering. "The king is gone. Gone riddance. Long live the president. My father knows Dawood Khan. Did you know that, Amir?" "So does my father," I said. In reality, I had no idea if that was true or not. "So does my father," Asif mimicked me in a whining voice. Kamal and Wali crackled in unison. I wished Baba were there. "Well, Dawood Khan dined at our house last year," Asif went on. "How do you like that, Amir?" I wondered if anyone would hear us scream in this remote patch of land. Baba's house was a good kilometer away. I wished we'd stayed at the house. "Do you know what I will tell Dawood Khan the next time he comes to our house for dinner?" Asif said. "I'm going to have a little chat with him, man to man, mard to mard. Tell him what I told my mother about Hitler. Now there was a leader, a great leader, a man with vision. I'll tell Dawood Khan to remember that if they had let Hitler finish what he had started, the world be a better place now. Baba says Hitler was crazy, that he ordered a lot of innocent people killed," I heard myself say before I could clamp a hand on my mouth. Asif snickered. "He sounds like my mother, and she's German. She should know better. But then they want you to believe that, don't they? They don't want you to know the truth." I didn't know who they were or what truth they were hiding, and I didn't want to find out. I wished I hadn't said anything. I wished again I'd look up and see Baba coming up the hill. "But you have to read books they don't give out in the school," Asif said. "I have, and my eyes have been opened. Now I have a vision, and I'm going to share it with our new president. Do you know what it is?" I shook my head. He'd tell me anyway. Asif always answered his own questions. His blue eyes flicked to Hassan. "Afghanistan is the land of Pashtuns. It always has been, always will be. We are the true Afghans, the pure Afghans, not this flat nose here. His people pollute our homeland, our Vatan. They dirty our blood." He made a sweeping, grandiose gesture with his hands. "Afghanistan for Pashtuns, I say. That's my vision." Asif shifted his gaze to me again. He looked like someone coming out of a good dream. "Too late for Hitler," he said, "but not for us." He reached for something from the back pocket of his jeans. "I'll ask the president to do what the king didn't have the Qawwat to do, to rid Afghanistan of all dirty Kasif Hazaras." "Just let us go, Asif," I said, hating the way my voice trembled. "We're not bothering you." "Oh, you're bothering me," Asif said, and I saw with a sinking heart what he had fished out of his pocket. Of course, his stainless steel brass knuckles sparkled in the sun. "You're bothering me very much. In fact, you bother me more than this Hazara here. How can you talk to him, play with him, let him touch you?" he said, his voice dripping with disgust. Wali and Kamal nodded and grunted in agreement. Asif narrowed his eyes, shook his head. When he spoke again, he sounded as baffled as he looked. "How can you call him your friend?" "But he's not my friend," I almost blurted. "He's my servant." Had I really thought that? Of course I hadn't. I treated Hassan well, just like a friend. Better even, more like a brother. But if so, then why, When Baba's friends came to visit with their kids, didn't I ever include Hassan in our games? Why did I play with Hassan only when no one else was around? Asif slipped on the brass knuckles, gave me an icy look. You're part of the problem, Amir. If idiots like you and your father didn't take these people in, we'd be rid of them by now. They'd all just go rot in Hazarajat where they belong. You're a disgrace to Afghanistan. I looked in his crazy eyes and saw that he meant it. He really meant to hurt me. Asif raised his fist and came for me. There was a flurry of rapid movement behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Hassan bend down and stand up quickly. Asif's eyes flicked to something behind me and widened with surprise. I saw that same look of astonishment on Kamal and Vali's faces as they too saw what had happened behind me. I turned and came face to face with Hassan's slingshot. Hassan had pulled the white elastic band all the way back. In the cup was a rock the size of a walnut. Hassan held the slingshot pointed directly at Asif's face. His hand trembled with the strain of the pulled elastic band, and beads of sweat had erupted on his brow. Please leave us alone, Agha, Hassan said in a flat tone. He'd referred to Asif as Agha, and I wondered briefly what it must be like to live with such an ingrained sense of one's place in a hierarchy. Asif gritted his teeth. Put it down, you motherless Hazara. Please leave us be, Agha, Hassan said. Asif smiled. Maybe you didn't notice, but there are 3 of us and 2 of you. Hassan shrugged. To an outsider, he didn't look scared. But Hassan's face was my earliest memory, and I knew all of its subtle nuances. Knew each and every twitch and flicker that ever rippled across it. And I saw that he was scared. He was scared plenty. You are right, Agha, but perhaps you didn't notice that I'm the one holding the slingshot. If you make a move, they'll have to change your nickname from Asif the Ear Eater to One-Eyed Asif, because I have this rock pointed at your left eye. He said this so flatly that even I had to strain to hear the fear that I knew hid under that calm voice. Asif's mouth twitched. Vali and Kamal watched this exchange with something akin to fascination. Someone had challenged their god, humiliated him, and worst of all, that someone was a skinny Hazara. Asif looked from the rock to Hassan. He searched Hassan's face intently. What he found in it must have convinced him of the seriousness of Hassan's intentions, because he lowered his fist. You should know something about me, Hazara, Asif said gravely. I'm a very patient person. This doesn't end today, believe me. He turned to me. This isn't the end for you either, Amir. Someday, I'll make you face me 1-to-1. Asif retreated a step. His disciples followed. Your Hazara made a big mistake today, Amir. They then turned around, walked away. I watched them walk down the hill and disappear behind the wall. Hassan was trying to tuck the slingshot in his waist with a pair of trembling hands. His mouth curled up into something that was supposed to be a reassuring smile. It took him 5 tries to tie the string of his trousers. Neither of us said much of anything as we walked home in trepidation, certain that Asif and his friends would ambush us every time we turned a corner. They didn't, and that should have comforted us a little, but it didn't, not at all. For the next couple of years, the words economic development and reform danced on a lot of lips in Kabul. The constitutional monarchy had been abolished, replaced by a republic led by a president of the republic. For a while, a sense of rejuvenation and purpose swept across the land. People spoke of women's rights and modern technology. And for the most part, even though a new leader lived in Arg, the royal palace in Kabul, life went on as before. People went to work on Saturday through Thursday and gathered for picnics on Fridays in parks, on the banks of Qarqa Lake, in the gardens of Pagman. Multicolored buses and lorries filled with passengers, roared through the narrow streets of Kabul, led by the constant shouts of the driver assistants who straddled the vehicle's rear bumpers and yelped directions to the driver in their thick Kabuli accent. On Eid, the 3 days of celebration after the holy months of Ramadan, Kabulis dressed in their best and newest clothes and visited their families. People hugged and kissed and greeted each other with Eid Mubarak, Happy Eid. Children opened gifts and played with dyed hard-boiled eggs. Early that following winter of 1974, Hassan and I were playing in the yard one day, building a snow fort, when Ali called him in. "Hassan, Agha Sahib wants to talk to you." He was standing by the front door, dressed in white, hands tucked under his armpits, breath puffing from his mouth. Hassan and I exchanged a smile. We'd been waiting for his call all day. It was Hassan's birthday. "What is it, father? Do you know? Will you tell us?" Hassan said. His eyes were gleaming. Ali shrugged. "Agha Sahib hasn't discussed it with me." "Come on, Ali, tell us," I pressed. "Is it a drawing book? Maybe a new pistol?" Like Hassan, Ali was incapable of lying. Every year, he pretended not to know what Baba had bought Hassan or me for our birthdays. And every year, his eyes betrayed him, and we coaxed the goods out of him. This time, though, it seemed he was telling the truth. Baba never missed Hassan's birthday. For a while, he used to ask Hassan what he wanted, but he gave up doing that because Hassan was always too modest to actually suggest a present. So every winter, Baba picked something out himself. He bought him a Japanese toy truck one year, an electric locomotive and train track set another year. The previous year, Baba had surprised Hassan with a leather cowboy hat, just like the one Clint Eastwood wore in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which had unseated The Magnificent Seven as our favorite Western. That whole winter, Hassan and I took turns wearing the hat and belted out the film's famous music as we climbed mounds of snow and shot each other dead. We took off our gloves and removed our snow-laden boots at the front door. When we stepped into the foyer, we found Baba sitting by the wood-burning cast-iron stove with a short, balding Indian man dressed in a brown suit and red tie. "Hassan," Baba said, smiling coyly, "meet your birthday present." Hassan and I traded blank looks. There was no gift-wrapped box in sight. No bag, no toy. Just Ali standing behind us and Baba with this slight Indian fellow who looked a little like a mathematics teacher. The Indian man in the brown suit smiled and offered Hassan his hand. "I am Dr. Kumar," he said. "It's a pleasure to meet you." He spoke Farsi with a thick, rolling Hindi accent. "Salam alaikum," Hassan said uncertainly. He gave a polite tip of the head, but his eyes sought his father behind him. Ali moved closer and set his hand on Hassan's shoulder. Baba met Hassan's very puzzled eyes. "I have summoned Dr. Kumar from New Delhi. Dr. Kumar is a plastic surgeon." "Do you know what that is?" the Indian man Dr. Kumar said. Hassan shook his head. He looked to me for help, but I shrugged. "All I knew was that you went to a surgeon to fix you when you had appendicitis. I knew this because one of my classmates had died of it the year before, and the teacher had told us they had waited too long to take him to a surgeon." We both looked to Ali, but of course with him you could never tell. His face was impassive as ever, though something sober had melted into his eyes. "Well," Dr. Kumar said, "my job is to fix things on people's bodies. Sometimes their faces." "Oh," Hassan said. He looked from Dr. Kumar to Baba to Ali. His hand touched his upper lip. "Oh," he said again. "It's an unusual present, I know," Baba said, "and probably not what you had in mind. But this present will last you forever." "Oh," Hassan said. He licked his lips, cleared his throat. Aga Sahib, will it? Nothing doing, Dr. Kumar intervened, smiling kindly. It will not hurt you one bit. In fact, I will give you a medicine and you will not remember a thing. Oh, Hassan said. He smiled back with relief. A little relief anyway. I wasn't scared, Aga Sahib. Hassan might have been fooled, but I wasn't. I knew that when doctors said it wouldn't hurt, that's when you knew you were in trouble. With dread, I remembered my circumcision the year prior. The doctor had given me the same line, reassured me it wouldn't hurt one bit. But when the numbing medicine wore off, later that night, it felt like someone had pressed a red-hot coal to my loins. Why Baba waited until I was 10 to have me circumcised was beyond me, and one of the things I will never forgive him for. I wished I too had some kind of a scar that would beget Baba's sympathy. It wasn't fair. Hassan hadn't done anything to earn Baba's affections. He'd just been born with that stupid hair lip. The surgery went well. We were all a little shocked when they first removed the bandages, but kept our smiles on just as Dr. Kumar had instructed us. It wasn't easy, because Hassan's upper lip was a grotesque mesh of swollen raw tissue. I expected Hassan to cry with horror when the nurse handed him the mirror. Ali held his hand as Hassan took a long, thoughtful look into it. He muttered something I didn't understand. I put my ear to his mouth. He whispered it again. Tashakkur, thank you. Then his lips twisted, and that time I knew just what he was doing. He was smiling, just as he had emerging from his mother's womb. The swelling subsided and the wound healed with time. Soon it was just a pink, jagged line running up from his lip. But the following winter, it was only a faint scar, which was ironic because that was the winter that Hassan stopped smiling. Chapter 6. Winter. Here is what I do on the first day of a snowfall every year. I step out of the house early in the morning, still in my pajamas, hugging my arms against the chill. I find the driveway, my father's car, the walls, the trees, the rooftops, and the hills buried under a foot of snow. I smile. The sky is seamless and blue, the snow so white my eyes burn. I shovel a handful of the fresh snow into my mouth. Listen to the muffled stillness broken only by the cawing of crows. I walk down the front steps, barefoot, and call for Hassan to come out and see. Winter was every kid's favorite season in Kabul, at least those whose fathers could afford to buy a good iron stove. The reason was simple. They shut down school for the icy season. Winter to me was the end of long division and naming the capital of Bulgaria, and the start of 3 months of playing cards by the stove with Hassan, free Russian movies on Tuesday mornings at Cinema Park, sweet turnip korma over rice for lunch after a morning of building snowmen. And kites, of course, flying kites and running them. For a few unfortunate kids, winter did not spell the end of the school year. There were the so-called voluntary winter courses. No kid I knew ever volunteered to go to these classes. Parents, of course, did the volunteering for them. Fortunately for me, Baba was not one of them. I remember one kid, Ahmad, who lived across the street from us. His father was some kind of doctor, I think. Ahmad had epilepsy and always wore a wool vest and thick black-rimmed glasses. He was one of the Asif's regular victims. Every morning, I watched from my bedroom window as their Hazara servant shoveled the snow from the driveway, cleared the way for the black Opel. I made a point of watching Ahmad and his father get into the car, Ahmad in his wool vest and winter coat, his school bag filled with books and pencils. I waited until they pulled away, turned the corner, then slipped back into bed in my flannel pajamas. I pulled the blanket to my chin, and watched the snow-capped hills in the north through the window. Watched them until I drifted back to sleep. I loved wintertime in Kabul. I loved it for the soft pattering of snow against my window at night, for the way fresh snow crunches under my black rubber boots, for the warmth of the cast iron stove as the wind screeched through the yards, the streets, but mostly because as the trees froze and ice sheathed the roads, the chill between Baba and me thawed a little. And the reason for that was the kites. Baba and I lived in the same house, but in different spheres of existence. Kites were the one paper-thin slice of intersection between those spheres. Every winter, districts in Kabul held a kite fighting tournament, and if you were a boy in Kabul, the day of the tournament was undeniably the highlight of the cold season. I never slept the night before the tournament. I'd roll from side to side, make shadow animals on the wall, even sit on the balcony in the dark, a blanket wrapped around me. I felt like a soldier trying to sleep in the trenches the night before a major battle. And that wasn't so far off. In Kabul, fighting kites was a little like going to war. As with any war, you had to ready yourself for battle. For a while, Hassan and I used to build our own kites. We saved our weekly allowances in the fall, dropped the money in a little porcelain horse Baba had bought one time from Herat. When the winds of winter began to blow and the snow fell in chunks, we undid the snap under the horse's belly. We went to the bazaar and bought bamboo, glue, string, and paper. We spent hours every day shaving bamboo for the center and cross spars, cutting the thin tissue paper which made for easy dipping and recovery. And then, of course, we had to make our own string or tar. If the kite was the gun, then tar, the glass-coated cutting line, was the bullet in the chamber. We'd go out in the yard and feed up to 500 feet of string through a mixture of ground glass and glue. We'd then hang the line between the trees, leave it to dry. The next day, we'd wind the battle-ready line around a wooden spool. By the time the snow melted and the rains of spring swept in, every boy in Kabul bore telltale horizontal gashes on his fingers from a whole winter of fighting kites. I remember how my classmates and I used to huddle, compare our battle scars on the first day of school. The cuts stung and didn't heal for a couple of weeks, but I didn't mind. They were reminders of a beloved season that had once again passed too quickly. Then the class captain would blow his whistle and we'd march in single file to our classrooms, longing for winter already, greeted instead by the specter of yet another long school year. But it quickly became apparent that Hassan and I were better kite fighters than kite makers. Some flaw or other in our design always spelled its doom. So Baba started taking us to Saifo's to buy our kites. Saifo was a nearly blind old man who was a moochie by profession, a shoe repairman. But he was also the city's most famous kite maker. Working out of a tiny hovel in Jadde-Meivand, the crowded street south of the muddy banks of the Kabul River. I remember you had to crouch to enter the prison cell-sized store, and then had to lift the trapdoor to creep down a set of wooden steps to the dank basement where Safiu stored his coveted kites. Baba would buy us each 3 identical kites and spools of glass strings. If I changed my mind and asked for a bigger and fancier kite, Baba would buy it for me, but then he'd buy it for Hassan too. Sometimes I wished he wouldn't do that, wished he'd let me be the favorite. The kite fighting tournament was an old winter tradition in Afghanistan. It started early in the morning on the day of the contest and didn't end until only the winning kite flew in the sky. I remember one year the tournament outlasted daylight. People gathered on sidewalks and roofs to cheer for their kids. The streets filled with the kite fighters. jerking and tugging on their lines, squinting up to the sky, trying to gain position to cut the opponent's line. Every kite fighter had an assistant, in my case, Hassan, who held the spool and fed the line. One time, a bratty Hindi kid whose family had recently moved into the neighborhood told us that in his hometown, kite fighting had strict rules and regulations. You have to play in a boxed area, and you have to stand at a right angle to the wind, he said proudly. And you can't use aluminum to make your glass string. Hassan and I looked at each other, cracked up. The Hindi kid would soon learn what the British learned earlier in the century, and what the Russians would eventually learn by the late 1980s. The Afghans are an independent people. Afghans cherish custom but abhor rules. And so it was with kite fighting. The rules were simple. No rules. Fly your kite, cut the opponents, good luck. Except that wasn't all. The real fun began when a kite was cut. That was where the kite runners came in. Those kids who chased the wind-blown kite drifting through the neighborhoods until it came spiraling down on a field, dropping in someone's yard, on a tree or a rooftop. The chase got pretty fierce. Hordes of kite runners swarmed the streets, shoved past each other like those people from Spain I'd read about once, the ones who ran from the bulls. One year, a neighborhood kid climbed a pine tree for a kite. A branch snapped under his weight and he fell 30 feet, broke his back and never walked again. But he fell with the kite still in his hands. And when a kite runner had his hands on a kite, no one could take it from him. That wasn't a rule, that was custom. For kite runners, the most coveted prize was the last fallen kite of the winter tournament. It was a trophy of honor, something to be displayed on a mantle for guests to admire. When the sky cleared of kites and only the final two remained, every kite runner readied himself for the chance to land his prize. He positioned himself at a spot that he thought would give him a head start. Tense muscles readied themselves to uncoil, necks craned, eyes crinkled, fights broke out, and when the last kite was caught, all hell broke loose. Over the years, I had seen a lot of guys run kites, but Hassan was by far the greatest kite runner I'd ever seen. It was downright eerie the way he always got the spot the kite would land before the kite did, as if he had some sort of inner compass. I remember one overcast winter day, Hassan and I were running a kite. I was chasing him through neighborhoods, hopping gutters, weaving through narrow streets. I was a year older than him, but Hassan ran faster than I did, and I was falling behind. "Hassan, wait!" I yelled, my breathing hot and ragged. He whirled around, motioned with his hand. "This way!" he called before dashing around another corner. I looked up, saw that the direction we were running was opposite to the one the kite was drifting. "We're losing it. We're going the wrong way," I cried out. "Trust me," I heard him call up ahead. I reached the corner and saw Hassan bolting along, his head down, not even looking at the sky, sweat soaking through the back of his shirt. I tripped over a rock and fell. I wasn't just slower than Hassan, but clumsier too. I'd always envied his natural athleticism. When I staggered to my feet, I caught a glimpse of Hassan disappearing around another street corner. I hobbled after him, spikes of pain battering my scraped knees. I saw we had ended up on a rutted dirt road near Istiklal Middle School. There was a field on one side where lettuce grew in the summer, and a row of sour cherry trees on the other. I found Hassan sitting cross-legged at the foot of one of the trees, eating from a fistful of dried mulberries. "What are we doing here?" I panted, my stomach roiling with nausea. He smiled. "Sit with me, Amir Agha." I dropped next to him, lay on a thin patch of snow, wheezing. "You're wasting our time. It was going the other way. Didn't you see?" Hassan popped a mulberry in his mouth. "It's coming," he said. I could hardly breathe, and he didn't even sound tired. How do you know? I said. I know. How can you know? He turned to me. A few sweat beads rolled from his bald scalp. Would I ever lie to you, Amir Agha? Suddenly, I decided to toy with him a little. I don't know, would you? I'd sooner eat dirt, he said with a look of indignation. Really? You'd do that? He threw me a puzzled look. Do what? Eat dirt if I told you to, I said. I knew I was being cruel, like when I taunt him if he didn't know some big word. But there was something fascinating, albeit in a sick way, about teasing Hassan. Kind of like when we used to play insect torture, except now he was the ants and I was holding the magnifying glass. His eyes searched my face for a long time. We sat there, two boys under a sour cherry tree, suddenly really looking at each other. That's when it happened again. Hassan's face changed. Maybe not changed, not really, but suddenly I had the feeling I was looking at two faces. The one I knew, the one that was my first memory, and another, a second face, this one lurking just beneath the surface. I'd seen it happen before. It always shook me up a little. It disappeared, this other face, for a fraction of a moment, long enough to leave me with the unsettling feeling that maybe I'd seen it someplace before. Then Hassan blinked and it was just him again, just Hassan. If you asked, I would, he finally said, looking right at me. I dropped my eyes. To this day, I find it hard to gaze directly at people like Hassan, people who mean every word they say. But I wonder, he added, would you ever ask me to do such a thing, Amir Agha? And just like that, he had thrown at me his own little test. If I was going to toy with him and challenge his loyalty, then he'd toy with me, test my integrity. I wish I hadn't started this conversation. I forced a smile. Don't be stupid, Hassan. You know I wouldn't. Hassan returned the smile, except his didn't look forced. I know, he said. And that's the thing about people who mean everything they say. They think everyone else does too. Here it comes, Hassan said, pointing to the sky. He rose to his feet and walked a few paces to his left. I looked up, saw the kite plummeting toward us. I heard footballs, shouts, and approaching melee of kite runners. But they were wasting their time because Hassan stood with his arms wide open, smiling, waiting for the kite. And may God, if he exists, that is, strike me blind if the kite didn't just drop into his outstretched arms. In the winter of 1975, I saw Hassan run a kite for the last time. Usually, each neighborhood held its own competition, but this year the tournament was going to be held in my neighborhood, Wazir Akbar Khan, and several other districts, Kartechar, Karteparwan, Mekrorayan, and Kutesengi had been invited. You could hardly go anywhere without hearing talk of the upcoming tournament. Word had it this was going to be the biggest tournament in 25 years. One night that winter, with the big contest only 4 days away, Baba and I sat in his study in overstuffed leather chairs by the glow of the fireplace. We were sipping tea, talking. Ali had served dinner earlier, potatoes and curried kale flour with rice, and had retired for the night with Hassan. Baba was flattening his pipe, and I was asking him to tell the story about the winter a pack of wolves had descended from the mountains in Herat and forced everyone to stay indoors for a week. When he lit a match and said casually, I think maybe you'll win the tournament this year. What do you think? I didn't know what to think or what to say. Was that what it would take? Had he just slipped me a key? I was a good kite fighter, actually a very good one. A few times I'd even come close to winning the winter tournament. Once I made it to the final 3, but coming close wasn't the same as winning, was it? Baba hadn't come close. He had won because winners won and everyone else just went home. Baba was used to winning at everything he set his mind to. Didn't he have the right to expect the same from his son? And just imagine if I did win. Baba smoked his pipe and talked. I pretended to listen, but I couldn't listen. Not really. Because Baba's casual little comment had planted a seed in my head, the resolution that I would win that winter's tournament. I was going to win. There was no other viable option. I was going to win and I was going to run that last kite. Then I'd bring it home and show it to Baba. Show him once and for all that his son was worthy. Then maybe my life as a ghost in this house would finally be over. I let myself dream. I imagined conversation and laughter over dinner instead of silence broken only by the clinking of silverware and the occasional grunt. I envisioned us taking a Friday drive in Baba's car to Pagman, stopping on the way at Qarqa Lake for some fried trout and potatoes. We'd go to the zoo to see Marjan the lion, and maybe Baba wouldn't yawn and steal looks at his wristwatch all the time. Maybe Baba would even read one of my stories. I'd write him 100 if I thought he'd read one. Maybe he'd call me Amir Jan like Rahim Khan did. And maybe, just maybe, I would finally be pardoned for killing my mother. Baba was telling me about the time he'd caught 14 kites on the same day. I smiled, nodded, laughed at all the right places, but I hardly heard a word he said. I had a mission now, and I wasn't going to fail Baba, not this time. It snowed heavily the night before the tournament. Hassan and I sat under the kursi and played panchpar as wind rattled tree branches, tapped on the window. Earlier that day, I'd asked Ali to set up the kursi for us, which was basically an electric heater under a low table covered with a thick, quilted blanket. Around the table, he arranged mattresses and cushions so as many as 20 people could sit and slip their legs under. Hassan and I used to spend entire snowy days snug under the kursi, playing chess, cards, mostly panchpar. I killed Hassan's 10 of diamonds, played him 2 jack and a 6. Next door in Baba's study, Baba and Rahim Khan were discussing business with a couple of other men. One of them I recognized as Asif's father. Through the wall, I could hear the scratchy sound of radio Kabul news. Hassan killed the 6 and picked up the jacks. On the radio, Dawood Khan was announcing something about foreign investment. He says someday we'll have television in Kabul, I said. Who? Dawood Khan, you ass, the president. Hassan giggled. I heard they already have it in Iran, he said. I sighed. Those Iranians. For a lot of Hazaras, Iran represented a sanctuary of sorts. I guess because like Hazaras, most Iranians were Shia Muslims. But I remembered something my teacher had said that summer about Iranians, that they were grinning smooth talkers who patted you on the back with one hand and picked your pocket with the other. As an Iranian, I don't know how I feel about this. I told Baba about that, and he said my teacher was one of those jealous Afghans. Jealous because Iran was a rising power in Asia, and most people around the world couldn't even find Afghanistan on a world map. It hurts to say that, he said, shrugging, but better to get hurt by the truth than comforted with a lie. I'll buy you one someday, I said. Hassan's face brightened. A television? In truth? Sure. And not the black and white kind either. Would probably be grown-ups by then, but I'll get us 2. One for you and one for me. I'll put it on my table where I keep my drawings, Hassan said. His saying that made me kind of sad. Sad for who Hassan was, where he lived, for how he'd accepted the fact that he'd grow old in that mud shack in the yard, the way his father had. I drew the last card, played him a pair of queens and a 10. Hassan picked up the queens. You know, I think you're going to make Agha Sahib very proud tomorrow. You think so? Inshallah, he said. Inshallah, I echoed, though the God-willing qualifier didn't sound as sincere coming from my lips. That was the thing with Hassan. He was so goddamn pure you always felt like a phony around him. I killed his king and played him my final card, the ace of spades. He had to pick it up. I'd won, but as I shuffled for a new game, I had this distinct suspicion that Hassan had let me win. Amir Agha, what? You know, I like where I live. He was always doing that, reading my mind. It's my home. Whatever, I said. Get ready to lose again. Okay, that's it for the second session, though I still don't know what's going to break off their friendship. See you on part 3.